Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here to review a movie called Teeth. Teeth. Wha- Obviously, if you probably read the description of this movie, or just hear what I have to say about this movie, ultimately you'll just find and ask yourself, or ask me, why ultimately review this movie. But I'm like, you know what? I just ultimately have one reviewed this movie previously before, and it wasn't exactly a cleaner variation of this movie because ultimately there is the goal of this movie is to basically showcase a woman uh, or a man in all of their glory at some point because there's a point to that. Justifiably, this movie is odd, but when looking at it, I'm like, meh. I've probably reviewed other odd films, and ultimately that won't stop me now from ultimately reviewing other odd films. It just won't. So here we go. So within this movie, I'm going to talk about this very in a non-spoiler like way, and then ultimately, once we get into me talking about the spoilers, we'll get there with that double five timed count. So before that amount of time, before I get to the spoilers, so this movie is one of those movies that feel one of a kind because in my mind I don't think anyone will ever try to do this kind of movie again, but it kind of sticks out there as a one of a kind like film. So we ultimately have it to where I'm gonna have to try to figure out some double word names for a lot of things because ultimately we have a character named Dawn who ultimately is trying to remain pure, meaning that she is trying to become abstinent of bedroom activity. Let's just say some action in the bedroom, if you know what I mean. She's trying to avoid it because there's a reason for that. Because ultimately, we find out that Dawn has some teeth in her down belows, in her bathroom region. Let's just say she has some teeth where you shouldn't honestly have teeth. So ultimately, that is the reason for why my real kind of way of thinking of I don't know how many people are gonna like what is this movie? What's going on? Somebody has some teeth down below, if you know what I mean. Ultimately, when there are guys that otherwise just so happen to just go like, well, you know what? I'm just gonna just thrust my business all up in her business. Their business ends up getting ripped off. Let's just say we get some ripped off business. To ultimately, we have to eventually see that business eventually after it gets ripped off. And some of the guys try to reattach their business. Some guys run away, and otherwise, there's sometimes other things tends to happen within this movie. Man, so in other words, a guy's ding along is gone, and ultimately we are just left with a bloody mess, and so that might be gross to a lot of people. Just letting everybody know that's how this movie goes. But anyways, when looking at it, it's a movie that is really pushing the fact of activity of sorts, and so ultimately, I guess that's the main thing to go on here with. Sure. I ultimately I thought that this was kind of interesting to where eventually Dawn, like at first, is just like in real just desperation uh, to be able to lose her cherry. Let's just say, like the desperation of her, just like God, could I just be touched by someone, and then that ends up to be just like going into further and further because ultimately she has been pure for so long. Let's just say. So we have to ultimately Dawn wants to think of these men as men that she is going to marry, and I guess that ultimately is the interesting goal within this movie. Uh, I thought that there was actually some more scenes going on in this movie. Maybe I got a different variation of this film. Like I thought there was like some scenes that I thought were in this movie, but maybe I was wrong. Um, like I think she was also trying to do like I thought she was trying to self experiment, and ultimately that ended up going horribly awry. But justifiably, I could be wrong about that because ultimately there might be, but still there might be two variations of this movie. I don't know how much further that this movie could be different. But anyways, so like I think there was probably one scene where ultimately she was taking some toys of sorts and going to town and those toys would usually just break, I think. But I guess maybe I was wrong about that. But anyways, so going into this movie, yeah, it's one of those films. It's one of those kinds of films where ultimately you just have a girl that's coming into her own, but then we realize that there is something um, more of her own that is unlike any other, and so eventually she has to try to beat this thing into submission and ultimately try to otherwise get with a guy, and that reasonably for the most part eventually just doesn't pan out, or so we are to believe. Hmm. So I thought that this movie was interesting how eventually this girl Dawn eventually uses this as a weapon, like eventually like really towards the end it just kind of feels like uh she's kind of just using this as like, God, like I really hate this person, so F it, we're just gonna go that way then. We're just gonna take this person out because I hate this person. So I don't know. I thought this movie was like interesting and ultimately so interesting that I had to go back and talk about it again and review it again because ultimately I had to do a cleaner variation of this in the end of all things. So let's go into that sweet double five to otherwise spoil this movie. Reasonably, at the end of the day, there's some stuff that when going into this movie, either it's some kind of visual of sorts or just the story altogether. Ultimately, people are just going to hate something about this. So that's okay, because I'm going to go out of my way to spoil it anyways. Because it's spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil whoo, this movie. So, again, I just say that ultimately at the end of the day, odd film. But it's cool. I don't. I've reviewed like I. If only you knew the whole entire journey that I've ever went on with every single movie. I've reviewed much more odder things. Believe me, it has happened. So at the end of the day, let's go out of our way to review Teeth. So so we ultimately have it to where Dawn ultimately is seemingly being a spokesperson for purity, which I thought like good for her. Ultimately, however, she wants to live her life is great. So you ultimately have it to where Dawn is ultimately seemingly going behind going and speaking to people about being pure and saving themselves from marriage and stuff like that, which is fine. So ultimately, we have it to where eventually we have it to where Dawn is ultimately seemingly at some point she is at some point being ridiculed for being uh, a pure person, but when also looking at it, it seems that there are plenty of people that want to be quasi like Dawn, but get very tempted. So we ultimately have it to where in a flashback scene, we ultimately have it to where it seems that Dawn and Brad, who is her brother or is her stepbrother, is ultimately sharing a pool with them, and Brad ultimately goes and tries to experiment upon his stepsister and finds that his finger had gotten a little bitten. So that is weird, but when going on further, we ultimately have it to where Dawn is seemingly looking for certain suitors. We have it to ultimately, we ultimately lead to have seemingly Dawn uh, end up going along with what is the first guy's name? I know the other guy's name because I just saw him. We ultimately have it to where eventually Dawn eventually gets her first guy that she meets during one of these meetings, who ultimately he is seemingly trying to be uh, abstinent in the eyes of his God, of Jesus, and we ultimately have it to where eventually Dawn and this guy are kind of spending like every time that they're meeting one another and they're talking and stuff like that. It seems like Dawn is ultimately mentioning that, uh, and eventually they go and double date, and recently it seems that Dawn is consistently thinking this guy and just going like, like maybe he would be a good guy to marry one day, and ultimately she sticks her fingers a little bit more downtown to otherwise justifiably not go that route because ultimately she had seen a horror movie minutes before, and that ultimately just kind of ruined her whole wedding thoughts. So eventually we have it to where Dawn and this guy double date, and eventually she ends up going like, you know what, like I just don't think like me and you should be with like I don't think you and me should see people, or you and me we should see one another because ultimately even like in a double date scenario like I'm just kind of uncomfortable being around you, which ultimately would probably lead this guy to believe that ultimately like she wants to get intimate with him or so on and so forth. So eventually Dawn goes to the fact where she's kind of being ridiculed for being this pure girl, and so eventually we have it to where eventually Dawn is just like God, I just don't care anymore. I just don't care. So ultimately we have it to where seemingly Dawn is going to go out with this guy alone to some uh to some lake or some pond or whatever, and so they end up both having bathing suits, and so they go out and they swim, and they ultimately lead into being within these rocks. And ultimately, we have it to where this guy is seemingly being a little bit too intimate for Dawn, and Dawn is like, you know what, I don't think that this is right. I think that we should save ourselves, blah, 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 blah. And we have it to where accidentally the guy otherwise is being a little bit too forward and ultimately ends up hitting Dawn ends up hitting her head on the back of this rock, and ultimately she gets a little knocked out of sorts. We ultimately have this guy who is otherwise trying to, I would say, probably wake up Dawn, but otherwise he was like really trying to push Dawn too far, even to a point where he is just ultimately rolling or pushing down his underwear and ultimately mentioning that the last time he had been uh, doing the herky jerky was at Easter. Was doing the little jerk of the burk, if you know what I mean. A little tug of the wug, if you know what I'm saying. A little bit of the. There's no more analogies that I need to go into. So he was doing some jerking the last time Easter, and so ultimately, I guess that is the reason why he is just at a point now where he is just, let's just say, frustrated. But that doesn't mean that he should have done what he done to Dawn, because ultimately she would have had to have she would have had to have said yes to this act, let's just say. But ultimately, she was kind of pushing him away, ultimately saying, like, no, I think that this is wrong, and so on and so forth. So eventually, we get to a point where this guy otherwise is just consistently trying to get with Dawn and trying to put himself in Dawn. And to ultimately, we have it to where this guy's dong gets chopped off. Ultimately, we find this guy's dong somewhere seemingly in the rocks, and we ultimately have this guy otherwise run away, run off somewhere. To ultimately, Dawn is like, "Oh my god!" Like, well, sucks to be him, because ultimately he forced himself on her, and ultimately he ultimately was a jerk. We found out really he was a jerk. So sucks to be him. So eventually we push on to have Dawn eventually like not quite understanding what had happened previously, and so eventually she goes into going to a doctor, which is Doctor Goldfry, or Godfrey. So we ultimately have Don going to this doctor, ultimately wanting to do a checkup, and because ultimately Don had ultimately been so worried about her down below business that ultimately she tried to look it up and research it, and ultimately like finding like putting in words like mutation or something like that. But ultimately, eventually, she found out what this backstory was and how basically this girl needs a champion to be able to fight her downtown business, and so recently it seems that ultimately we have Don who is eventually just going to the doctor, and so ultimately it seems that this doctor is this, I would call him probably a gynecologist or whatever. Um, but ultimately, we have it to where this doctor is just kind of like, oh, I'm sure you want birth control, right? But it seems like this doctor is having a little bit too much fun with Dawn. To ultimately, it seems that uh, he is kind of checking her down, checking downtown, and ultimately he is mentioning it's like, wow, you're really kind of tight, and so ultimately he just starts sticking more fingers in there than he probably should because ultimately he's a douchebag doctor. So ultimately have it to where this doctor just starts like kind of just putting his hands down there. To ultimately we have Dawn who's like, whoa, and ultimately here we go again with ultimately the doctor ultimately trying to all of a sudden feel there's something unusual, and then all of a sudden he is starting to go like, hey, like what did you do, what did you put it, what did you, so we ultimately have it to where this doctor ends up trying to get his hand back out of this woman, and we have it to where a very interesting scene where this doctor is trying to get his hand out of this woman, and he is really trying. We just have it to where this girl's like legs are just kind of flinging around, and he's just trying to get his fingers out. To ultimately find out when he finally does, he loses four of his fingers, rightfully so, I guess. And ultimately, we have the doctors yelling, "It's true! It's true!" I couldn't believe it, but it's true. And we have it to where Dawn is like running off because she doesn't know what's going on. She doesn't know what to do. So we eventually have it to where seemingly we have Dawn eventually going and at some point we have it to where we have Dawn's stepbrother Brad, who ultimately is a real douchebag, And so ultimately his thing is that since that one time where he got his finger a little bit chewed on, that has kind of left him to the point of anytime he's ever slept with a woman, he he goes through instead of her he goes through her butt. He goes through her butthole instead of going through the other route. So without a doubt, knowing full well, yeah. So ultimately, we have to where uh, Brad usually takes a woman from behind and ultimately goes through the hole that he knows is, I guess, much safer because he's a douchebag. But so we have it to where all women all over the world, whoever actually does sleep with Brad, ultimately are left unsatisfied because otherwise he is just a weird guy like that. So we ultimately have it to where Brad had, I guess, been so traumatized by otherwise been getting his finger chewed on that he just becomes this emo douchebaggy like person, and eventually we have it to where ultimately when Dawn comes home one day, uh, we end up finding out that Brad was too busy doing a little humping to realize that his mother was down on the floor, and ultimately we find out that Dawn's mother had passed away. And then eventually we have it to where eventually when Bill comes home, uh, who is who is Dawn and Brad's father, we eventually have eventually Bill die. Because justifiably we have it to where Brad ultimately goes and has this dog attack Bill, and that leads to Bill's death at some point. So we ultimately have Dawn meeting a another guy during this time, and that's what leads to her mother's death. We have it to ultimately Dawn meets Ryan, and Ryan seems to be experimenting with Dawn, but ultimately Ryan is giving her uh, he's giving her drugs, he's giving her like all kinds of stuff to loosen Dawn up. And so ultimately, we have it to Ryan is experimenting with toys, let's just say, and then eventually goes out of his way to actually perform an act with Dawn with absolutely no nibble, if you know what I mean. To ultimately, we have it to where Dawn is finally thinking that Ryan is like, "Oh my God, you're my champion, you're my savior. Oh, I can't believe it, finally." And so we ultimately have it to where eventually the next day, because Dawn had slept over at Ryan's place, we find out that Ryan had made a bet with one of his friends to ultimately try to get Dawn in his bed, and to ultimately just be like, "Oh yeah, I bet you mentioning that you were pure, like I guess you weren't pure enough or whatever it was." So we end up having Dawn just kind of frustrated that ultimately Ryan had made this bet, and so ultimately Dawn is like, "Oh well, that sucks," and then we have it to where Ryan eventually loses his dingaling as well, because ultimately I guess the drugs had worn off, and plus also at first this was seemingly going to be love, but it wasn't. So we have all these suitors and not quite right one true champion of all of this. And so eventually, when Dawn ultimately loses both of her parents, she is ultimately just like so angry at Brad for the loss of her parents that ultimately she is just going to just kill him, just kill Brad to just get even with him. So ultimately, Dawn is putting on her nice white dress and going to see Brad, and finally just going like, you know what, like I think it's time, Brad. because ultimately Brad had been trying to make her like feel just so uncomfortable and so like to the point where every time he talks to her, he's like, "Yeah, I bet you want me. I bet you do. I bet you like you've been waiting for a piece of this for I don't know how long now," and like and so on and so forth. To where ultimately, like Dawn is ultimately just like, "Well, you know what? Like I am gonna get a piece, but it's not the piece that you want." So Dawn goes in there and tries to be all romantic and seem like she actually wants him and yada yada yada. Brad ultimately goes back to the same old like, well, hey, like I want you to flip over, and so ultimately I can do the way that I think is safe, but Dawn ultimately won't agree to that. So Brad ultimately is like, fine. So ultimately he gets on top of her, and wouldn't you know it, we get another dingaling who has gone lost. Ultimately, to where Brad's dingaling gets chopped off, and we ultimately have the dingaling dropping on the floor. Ultimately, to have the dog have a disgusting snack, which makes no sense. But we ultimately have we ultimately have Brad who's like no, and so ultimately he is desperately yelling for Dawn to help her or help him, but she won't. So we eventually have it to where eventually Dawn ultimately just goes and just hitchhikes it. Because ultimately every man that otherwise puts a hand on her ends up just losing his John Dong sing along down below, thing. So we ultimately have it to where Don ultimately is just left with just being on the streets. So we have it to where the very last thing that we ultimately see is Don getting a hitchhike from a stranger, and ultimately that hitchhiking leads this guy to justifiably go like, it's all creepy and stuff. He's like, you know what I want, kind of thing, but he doesn't say anything, but you could see that with his eyes. And so recently, Don is ultimately just like, like I'm not gonna do anything with you. Like I'm just gonna get out of this car. Well, the car door is locked, and then she's ultimately just like, you know what, like, F it. So she's like, yeah, sure, I'll play along. Cause you don't know, buddy. You don't know. Recently, of course, just eventually, so she's just using this guy for his car, and then by and large, he's going to die shortly thereafter, and rightfully so. But yeah, this was a very bizarre movie, but at the end of the day, you could just say there was a one of a kind film that ultimately I saw at some point. Um, I want to see if ultimately this one. Oh, it was Toby. Toby was the first. Yeah, Toby was the first guy that Dawn went out with, and then went to the rocks, and then ultimately just left without his big old suit, bathing suit, bathing suit. Yeah, I saved that. Last minute. Okay, but anyways, yeah, bizarro film, but at the end of the day, I could just say that it was definitely different. I think that's what I liked about it most. Is it like I like watching movies that are more one of a kind than ultimately having to kind of watch like the same old song and dance that you've seen like 100 times. And like if you were to watch like a detective movie would always be the same song and dance for most of the time. Hence why most of the time I don't have much of like detective movies unless it's like has some like genre on top of it where it's like a sci-fi or a horror or it has some other element that ultimately feels like fresh or unique or different, or it's just a weird movie. So at the end of the day, that's all I want to say about this one. reasonably, for how many times that I've said that this movie is bizarre, weird, or whatever, I've seen it more than once. So, looking at it at the end of the day, this movie had also won a Scream Award at some point for having, and I thought that that was interesting, um, for the death of which that it ended. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think that's all I wanted to say about Teeth. I thought that this movie was, yeah, it was funny. Yeah, it was just kind of like a fun movie to look back on and just be like, yeah, this movie is still kind of like has got to be like the weirdest thing that I've seen, but I've seen other things. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.